Hello again, everyone. Now we're going to discuss reproductive technologies, or the moral permissibility of reproductive technologies. And specifically, we're going to talk about in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, and cloning. And for the sake of efficiency, we're going to clump all three of those together, although they do have some unique issues. For the most part, arguments in favor of one tend to support arguments in favor of the other two. And we'll see why that is in a second. But first we need to see just what's the general deal with these reproductive technologies. Why do people care so much about them? Why are they seen as important? And why do people think they should have access to them? And at least one of the major reasons why people care about these reproductive technologies is because all three processes would allow people with fertility issues to overcome those issues in ways that allow them to have healthy and biologically related children. Now, it's important to note that the biologically related bit is not necessary for in vitro fertilization or surrogacy, because couples can rely on donors in both of those cases. Right, so not every case of IVF or surrogacy is going to produce biologically related children, but still, many cases of IVS and surrogacy are used primarily because people want biologically related children. Otherwise, adoption would seem an open avenue for them, right? In addition to having healthy biologically related children, one of the main ways IVF, surrogacy, and cloning are promoted is because it would allow couples to bypass the passing of genetic disorders on to their progeny, right? So if one of the two people in the couple who want a child has some terrible genetic disorder that's likely to be passed on to their offspring, they can still use a donor to supply the other half, but still get pregnant through one of these means and bypass that passing on of the genetic disorder, while still having a child that is at least biologically related to one of the people in that couple. So why is this so important, right? So people seem to really care a lot. They seem to have a fundamental interest in having healthy biologically related children. And if that's the case, then all of these procedures, at least at first glance, seem like a good way of securing that interest, seem like a good way of satisfying people's desire for these healthy biologically related children. And so if it's such a good way of doing it and we have a fundamental interest in it, then you might think we have a right to these things. And some have argued that that's true. And that's who we're going to look at first is John Robertson. He argued that we have a right to procreative liberty. Right? So because of these interests we were just talking about, these suggest that we have this right. And procreative liberty is the freedom to either have children or avoid having them. And so Robertson's argument is very close to principle of autonomy arguments we've used throughout the semester. Right? He wants to say that control over our reproduction is central to our personal identity, dignity, and the meaning of one's life. So just as the right to autonomy gives us control over our death in the case of euthanasia by giving us a right to die, Robertson says it also applies here to reproduction. Reproduction is one of those very intimate decisions that people have to make about how their lives are going to go. And so we have a right based on autonomy to procreative liberty. So just to give you some examples here, right? He's claiming that this liberty really affects our self-determination, worth, and identity. So how could this be so? Well, let's look at one example where you're forced to reproduce or at least unable to avoid it. Right? He claims this would clearly detrimentally affect our self-identity, right? Why would this be? Well, because having children initially at least, changes both your social and moral responsibilities in the world, right? Having a child gives you additional moral responsibilities that you did not have before. So that changes your self-determination very clearly. It also changes the meaning of one's life very clearly. In addition, being forced to reproduce or unable to avoid it is going to end up having effects on your psychology and your social identity, right? We view people who have children in different ways than we view those who do not have children. So once again, that affects your self-determination, worth, and identity. And then in a very sort of physical sense, it literally changes women's bodies and imposes a temporary burden on them. So if they're unable to avoid that, right, it's definitely going to affect their self-determination if now they are stuck with this burden they do not want, and it keeps them from doing other things they prefer to do with their lives. Another example would be a couple who is unable to reproduce. Right, so this is, at least in our society, seen as a great loss for many couples, and this could be either because reproduction allows them to gain something of religious significance, or it could be a way for them to express the love and unity that many couples seek. So if the value of your life or your sense of worth or dignity is sort of caught up in at least being able to reproduce, then if we limit that liberty, we're going to negatively affect your self-determination, right? So this right to autonomy seems to give us this right to procreative liberty. We haven't said much, though, about what the right to procreative liberty actually looks like, and Robertson does a good job of clarifying this here. So he says, first, this right to procreative liberty is a negative right. What does that mean? It means that when we exercise this right, we're not causing ourselves to violate any moral duty we have. And since we're not doing anything morally wrong, people have a duty not to interfere with our right. So if you have a negative right, that means not that anybody has to give you anything. They just have to refrain from interfering with the action that you have a right to. So if you have a right to procreative liberty and it's a negative right, that means you might have a right to secure contraception, and nobody has the ability to interfere with you on that right. They have a duty to allow you to go get your contraception. 2, this right doesn't include other things we normally think are included in the process of a pregnancy. All right, so just because you have a right to procreative liberty doesn't also mean you have a right to the healthcare you need to deliver the baby, or a right to have the involvement of the partner, so on and so forth, right? Those are additional moral worries. The right to procreative liberty literally just is discussing your right to reproduce or your right to avoid reproduction. It's not talking about any of those other things down the line in the course of a pregnancy. There might be rights to those things as well, but they don't stem from the right to procreative liberty. Third, this right to procreative liberty is only a presumptive liberty. In other words, that means it could be limited, right? So if there's a reproductive action that you want to perform, but that action would cause significant harm to some being or to society, then your right to procreative liberty could be outweighed in that case, right? So it's not this standalone fundamental right that can never be violated. It can be outweighed in some cases, but you're going to need very compelling reasons if you're going to override this right, given that it's based on these sort of very intimate autonomy decisions we have to make about our lives. And then finally, this right to procreative liberty includes both the freedom to produce and the freedom to avoid reproduction, and we'll talk about what that means here right now. So first, this right gives you the freedom to avoid reproduction. So what reproductive actions does this protect? Well, before pregnancy, this protects the actions on this list here. So it gives you the freedom to abstain from sex, the freedom to use contraception, or the freedom to refuse to seek treatment for infertility. All right, so these are all actions you perform to avoid reproduction. These are protected by the right. After pregnancy, you have some reproductive actions on the table that could help you avoid reproduction, namely an abortion. So it seems like, at least initially, the right to procreative freedom protects all of these actions. Now, Robertson doesn't actually give us a conclusion here about the countervailing reasons and their weight against your liberty, but he at least says, look, in terms of the freedom to avoid reproduction, it's going to protect these actions so long as the countervailing reasons aren't too strong or so strong that they override these reproductive actions. So here are some countervailing reasons, right? If you want these reproductive actions, you got to make sure these countervailing reasons are done away with. So reasons against could be that there are societal interests in increasing population. So you want to avoid reproduction, but society would be harmed. Society needs to increase its population. Your partner could have an interest in both intimacy and progeny, right? So initially you think you have a freedom to abstain from sex and avoid getting pregnant, but you might have a moral obligation to your partner to be open intimately, or to at least be open to getting pregnant and providing progeny for them, so on and so forth. There could also be some moral views about the unity of sex and reproduction. So if you are avoiding sex or avoiding reproduction based on sexual intercourse, then you could be violating that unity. And then there's all the other stuff about abortion we've talked about before. So we need to see whether any of those countervailing reasons are strong enough to override our freedom to avoid reproduction. On the other hand, this right protects our freedom to reproduce. What actions does this protect? The freedom to find a willing partner, engage in sexual intercourse, achieve pregnancy, carry it to term, so on and so forth. Here I think it's important just to point out again that we're dealing with a negative right. So this isn't a claim that we have someone has to help us, right? It's not that we have the freedom to find a willing partner and engage in sexual intercourse and somebody has to assist us, otherwise our right is violated. No, that's not what's happening here. All this says is that no one can interfere with us when we're trying to perform any of these reproductive actions up here. Okay, so what could be some countervailing reasons weighing against our freedom to reproduce? Could be that there's overpopulation. So normally we're free to reproduce, but producing right now would cause irreparable harm to society in the form of overpopulation. So our right to reproduce is outweighed. Could be that the parents are not fit to raise children. It could be that the offspring will be harmed if you reproduce, or it could be that it imposes unreasonable cost on the state or others because you don't have the financial means to take care of your children and others will be forced to, so on and so forth. Right? So we're going to have to do a lot of weighing here. Robertson doesn't tell us how this weighing goes. Robertson's job here is just to say, look, we have this right. We have this right because we have a fundamental autonomy interest in our reproductive choices. And then our reproductive freedom is protected in the following ways, right? Through all the reproductive actions we just listed. Now he says, look, the countervailing reasons might be very strong in some cases, so we're going to have to think about that. And in the next video, we'll see Peter Singer and Marianne Warren both are going to say that the countervailing reasons given most of the time are not strong enough to outweigh this right to procreative liberty. And that's what we'll do in the next video. Thank you.